Well, as I mentioned before, there are three kinds of wisdom that we see in literature on wisdom. There is philosophical wisdom, which is focused on rationality and justifying true beliefs. How do you think, and how do you hold beliefs such that they correspond to some truth and reality? There's practical wisdom, knowing how to act ethically, how to give advice, and how to effectively have intuitions about what's going on. Are your intuitions good? Are they bad? Do you often interpret circumstances according to what's going on or according to what's within you? If you are able to identify in a social circumstance what's actually happening and to be able to solve problems to meet everyone's needs, that's practical wisdom. But of course, as I said, we also have cosmic or divine wisdom. Wisdom is also a force that transmutes the universe. It's a creative force that ushers in order out of the potential for order. And we see in the book of Proverbs in the Bible, it explicitly says that by wisdom the Lord laid the earth's foundations. All right, so let's first touch on the scientific approaches to wisdom. We'll see how that's being talked about in psychology, and then we'll go into some of the heritage of these ideas through mostly Judaism. I'm going to focus on that quite a bit today. So the three main approaches to wisdom studies are to articulate it as either an expert knowledge system, a personality dimension, or a way of reasoning about problems. So the first form comes from Paul Baltz. He's a German researcher, and this is what's called the Berlin wisdom paradigm. So according to this paradigm, wisdom is an expert knowledge system dealing with the conduct and understanding of life. So it's very biased towards the practical form of wisdom. You have to know how to give advice, how to solve problems, and how to act ethically in the world. From a 2008 paper, they say individuals use this knowledge to construct their lives. Alternatively, they help co-construct the lives of others through good advice, exceptional judgment, excellent mentoring, or insightful organization of education and society. So there's two interesting things that stand out about this model of wisdom. One of them is that you have to have knowledge before acting through that knowledge. So that's something which is contentious, but the way that this frames it is that you have an eternal form of knowledge that is contained within you. It doesn't go anywhere once you have it, and if only you can apply this knowledge, then you are a wise person. Secondly, what stands out is that it is an inherently pro-social phenomena, according to Paul Baltz. You have to be able to construct your life and to construct the lives of others. If you are not a good influence on yourself and society, well then, according to this, we can't say that you're wise. So this is the way that they measure this phenomena. They will take a bunch of people, put them in a lab, and give them a series of vignettes, small, short problems, and they'll ask people to speak a response about how they would deal with these kinds of problems. So the sample one I have here, I picked for its brevity. A 15-year-old girl wants to get married right away. And you'll see we have a number of different framings, and the reason that we frame them differently is because different ways of approaching the issue will get people to have different responses, right? You'll notice that Group A says, what should one or she consider and do? That's very impersonal, it's very removed. You don't have to know this person, you don't have any information about her context, which is very different from Group C. Imagine your own 15-year-old daughter wants to get married right away. Well, that's going to activate different systems of reasoning, different systems of interpretation. It's much more emotionally salient to you, so we're going to see how well you can see through your emotions and manage your emotions. And you're going to know a lot more about the context of your own daughter than somebody else's daughter. So to pick apart these differences in context, the Baltz Berlin wisdom paradigm will frame the issue differently to see in what contexts people are going to reason wisely more likely. And there are 5 criterion for determining the level of wisdom. So you have a number of raters that will read a transcript of people's verbal responses, and they will try to identify these 5 dimensions within the response. So you need to have a high level of factual knowledge, again, referring to wisdom here as a stable propositional way of knowing. So you need to know about the issue. You need to maybe know what marriage is, for example. You need to have high levels of procedural knowledge, so it's not just enough to know the facts of the issue, but you have to know how to apply those facts. Lifespan contextualism is important because, well, if you're getting married at 15 and you're getting married at 30, those are very different kinds of experiences. You're going to think about them in different ways. You have different wants and needs. So a recognition of those differences is important. 4, value relativism refers mostly to a kind of cultural relativism. For example, if we're trying to give advice to this 15-year-old girl, we might want to ask, what are her options? Does she live in a country where she doesn't have any choice and she might be murdered because she doesn't want to go through with this decision? That's going to weigh into how we give this individual advice, versus if she is listening to My Chemical Romance and reading Romeo and Juliet and getting really excited and wants to elope. Very different circumstances. Lastly, we have recognition and management of uncertainty. So you'll notice that this recognition of uncertainty is always going to pop up in frames of wisdom because, well, life is uncertain. It's really hard to tell what the hell is happening and what's going to happen next. So being able to recognize that, knowing that the way that you're seeing the world isn't the only way to see the world, is really important. People who have dogmatic beliefs and can't see outside of their frame usually are very rigid and resilient in their beliefs, and that's kind of antithetical to what wisdom is typically thought to be, which is a kind of openness, a cognitive flexibility that helps you adapt to varying circumstances. Oh, and also to just know that sometimes you can't solve a problem and you can't do what's right, Acknowledging that is important. So, we had first wisdom as a kind of knowledge contained within the individual. Now we have this second model coming from Monica Ardelt. She writes about wisdom as a personality dimension. And there are 3 kinds of dimensions. The first is a reflective dimension, which means you have to be willing to take on different perspectives. You have to learn from your mistakes and overcome defense mechanisms, and be open to self-examination, self-insight, and self-awareness. It's really easy to see why this is the case, because anybody that's the opposite of these things is a horrible person to deal with. There's a cognitive dimension, which refers again to reasoning. It always is the case that reasoning about problems is important to these models. There is supposed to be in a person a desire for an understanding of truth, even if truth may compromise one's self-image, an ability and willingness to understand the situation thoroughly, and an acceptance of the unpredictability and uncertainty in life. So again, we get that uncertainty factor. Lastly, there's an affective component. Compassionate love for others is recommended, and directing positive emotions and actions towards others also recommended, which matches up with wisdom traditions. Loving kindness is a very important kind of meditation in Buddhist practice. It's always done in conjunction with other kinds of meditation. To extend compassion towards people is always associated with wisdom, and for good reason. It's something that can elevate people's spirits, their mood, and overall, especially if you think in the context of raising children, compassion is very important. If you don't have compassion in dealing with people, especially in dealing with young people, it's very easy to break their nervous system. Okay, so, one thing that I wanted to mention before moving on. This model of wisdom is criticized for not really being its own thing. It's like a statistical ghost, you would call it. Some people say that we have constructs that already get at these things, such as emotional competency, otherwise known as emotional intelligence. So it's not really certain that these dimensions all sort of refer to one thing called wisdom. They might be a bunch of loosely connected things that have other names in other places. But according to Monica Ardelt's research, she's found that if you rate high on all of these dimensions, which is required for wisdom, you can't just be high on one of these and not the others, but if all 3 of these you happen to have high scores on, typically your subjective state of well-being is greater. And in her paper, she talks about how rating high on these dimensions is a better predictor for well-being than is objective material life factors, such as how much money you have, what your socioeconomic status was growing up, and what the availability of resources is, etc., what your age is. All of those factors don't seem to predict well-being as much as a collection of these factors. And that notion of well-being is very important, too, for wisdom, because that's often articulated as a life well-lived. Okay, so last model, wise reasoning. Igor Grossman refers to this not as a kind of knowledge you have or as a personality trait that you have, but as a way you think and reason about problems. Specifically, he says it's the use of certain types of pragmatic reasoning to navigate important challenges of social life. So again, we're really heavily biased on the practical wisdom approach. Wise reasoning involves the following dimensions: intellectual humility, self-transcendence, and a consideration of others' perspectives. So the first one refers to the fact that, well, you can't really think that you already know everything. You have to be open to other people's perspectives. Self-transcendence refers to being able to see beyond yourself, to take something other than an egoistic perspective, to elevate other people's perspectives and needs as valuable. And that all sort of collapses into the third one, as you can see. So, interestingly, wise reasoning is very unpredictable. How they measure this is, actually, that's distracting. I'll take that away right now. How they measure this is they will hire people to fill out a series of journals over a several-week period. And they will have specific methods for facilitating accurate recall of memories. So you'll go through a sheet and it'll ask you a bunch of different facts about what happened, where were you, who else was around, etc., how were you feeling. And then you'll write out a difficult problem you had throughout the week, and then you'll write about how you tried to approach that problem, how you tried to solve it, and how you're feeling about it now. And what Grossman's lab has found is that it's actually very unreliable within a particular individual person to predict when they're going to be reasoning wisely. There's greater individual variability than across-person variability, meaning that in a group of people, you'll find more consistency in how often they're reasoning wisely compared to within a single person, where they're kind of all over the place. So what it seems is that wise reasoning happens in a particular state of consciousness. It happens in a particular state of mind. It's a way of holding your mind, of holding the space, of holding the information that you're confronted with that enables you to reason wisely. And these are the dimensions that are supposed to be the state-level predictors for people reasoning wisely. So the first is a bigger picture construal of the event, looking at things as a whole as opposed to picking out the small details and harping on them forever. You need more positive versus negative emotions, but there's greater emotional complexity overall in the state. So you might feel really elated at some information, and then you might feel some disappointment because it wasn't what you thought it was, and then you might feel anger, but then you feel, well, that's actually okay because of this other thing and all of the context involved. So there's lots of waves of emotion, but a bias towards the positive over the negatives. And that's interesting because emotions themselves are basically different tools for framing. They're different modes of information processing that you can apply to different contexts. So it makes sense that if you have a great range of emotions when considering a problem, you have a greater array and degree of perspectives and information that becomes made relevant to you. Now, importantly, though, to handle those emotions, lower emotional reactivity is required, so not taking the emotion too seriously and not being too put out by negative emotions, for example, being able to hold and sit with anger or sadness or fear. Less thought suppression is good, so, accepting what comes and not ignoring anything. And also there should be more reappraisal and forgiveness. So as you're considering what happened, you're more ready to reappraise the situation and to forgive yourself and those involved. Now, I like this model a lot for a few reasons. Actually, for one really big reason that has a bunch of other reasons. So note it has the word state here, right? State. It's a state of mind. It's a state as opposed to a trait of character. And you know what other kinds of state of consciousness have all of these dimensions? Psychedelics. So especially MDMA, like all of those reasons are why MDMA therapy is good for you. It gives you a great range of emotional complexity. It allows you to sit with and process potentially traumatic memories and allows you to integrate them. You suppress your thoughts less, and of course there's lots of reappraisal and forgiveness going on. When it comes to reintegrating traumatic memories, that precisely is a process of reappraising that information and being able to internalize the traumatic event, being able to accept it as a part of your narrative and not let it overcome you. So all of these things happen especially strongly in MDMA, but also in the experience of psilocybin and LSD and other sorts of psychedelics. So one of the arguments that I like to make sometimes is that the psychedelic state is effectively a state that enables wise reasoning. And we'll talk about some of the interesting experiences that happen in that, because reasoning isn't always a matter of just weighing propositions. Sometimes it's about consulting angels that have messages from God.